Margaret Chen had always been the kind of person who preferred to blend into the background rather than stand in the spotlight. At 53 years old, she worked as a librarian at Riverside Community College in Portland, Oregon, spending her days organizing books, helping students find research materials, and maintaining the quiet sanctuary she had come to love over the past 15 years. Her colleagues knew her as soft-spoken and gentle, someone who never raised her voice or drew attention to herself. She wore simple cardigans and comfortable shoes, kept her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and rarely participated in staff social events beyond a polite appearance. What no one at the college knew was that Margaret had a past she had deliberately left behind. A chapter of her life she had closed decades ago after a series of painful experiences that had driven her away from the world she once inhabited. Before becoming a librarian, before settling into this quiet existence, Margaret had been a concert pianist of considerable renown, having trained at Juilliard and performed in some of the most prestigious venues across Europe and North America during her 20s and early 30s. She had won competitions, received critical acclaim, and been on a trajectory that many musicians only dream about. However, the pressure, the constant scrutiny, the competitive nature of the classical music world, and a particularly devastating public criticism from a prominent music critic had broken something inside her. After a performance in Vienna where she had made a minor mistake that was blown out of proportion by the press, Margaret had suffered a breakdown and decided to walk away from it all. She returned to the United States, changed her professional path entirely, and built a new life where music remained only a private comfort, something she played alone in her small apartment on an old upright piano that had belonged to her grandmother. For 20 years, she had successfully maintained this separation between her past and present, never mentioning her former career to anyone, never attending concerts, and certainly never playing in public. Her hands, once insured for considerable sums, now stamped due dates in library books and typed catalog entries into databases. She had made peace with this choice, or so she told herself during the quiet evenings when her fingers would drift across the piano keys in her living room, playing Chopin and Rachmaninoff for an audience of none. The college community saw only the humble librarian, never suspecting that the woman who shushed students in the reference section had once brought audiences to tears with her interpretations of the great masters, and had been reviewed in the New York Times as a pianist of extraordinary sensitivity and technical brilliance. The trouble began on a Tuesday afternoon in late October when Margaret was sorting through returned books in the library's back office. Sarah Hendricks, the head of the college's music department, burst through the door with an energy that immediately put Margaret on edge. Sarah was everything Margaret was not. Bold, confident, always impeccably dressed in designer clothes that seemed far too expensive for a community college salary, and possessed of an ego that filled whatever room she entered. She had been hired 3 years ago after a mediocre career as an opera singer that had never quite taken off, and she ran the music department with an iron fist, constantly reminding students and staff alike of her connections in the music world and her own supposed accomplishments. Margaret had always kept her distance from Sarah, finding excuses to avoid the occasional interactions their jobs required. Sarah approached Margaret's desk without any greeting or preamble. The college was hosting its annual faculty appreciation dinner in 2 weeks, she announced, and this year the music department had been tasked with providing entertainment. Normally this would not have concerned Margaret in the slightest, as she had always managed to avoid such events. But Sarah explained that the college president had specifically requested that the entertainment this year should involve faculty members rather than students to emphasize the talent and dedication of the staff. Sarah had organized a musical showcase where various faculty members would perform, and she had been going through the personnel files to assign participation. Every department was expected to contribute at least one performer. Margaret felt her stomach tighten as Sarah continued talking. The library staff consisted of only 4 people, and the other 3 had already declined participation for various legitimate reasons. Tom Rodriguez, the assistant librarian, was recovering from surgery. Jenny Walsh had a speech impediment that made public performance impossible for her. David Kim was taking care of his elderly mother who had just moved into his home. That left only Margaret, and Sarah made it clear that refusal was not an option. The college president had been very specific that every department must participate, and Sarah had no intention of letting the library be the only department that failed to contribute. She had already told the president that the library would have someone performing. Margaret tried to explain that she had no performance skills, that she could not sing or play any instrument, but Sarah waved away her protests with a dismissive gesture. She had brought sheet music with her, pulling it from an expensive leather folder and placing it on Margaret's desk. It was a piano piece, she said, something simple that anyone with basic music reading skills could manage with a bit of practice. Sarah had noticed that Margaret sometimes hummed classical music while working, which surely meant she had some musical background. The piece was Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14, the first movement, commonly known as Moonlight Sonata. Sarah described it as an easy, slow piece that even beginners often learned, perfect for someone without performance experience. Margaret stared at the sheet music, her hands trembling slightly. She knew this piece intimately, had performed it countless times in her previous life. And she also knew that while the first movement appeared simple on the surface, it required enormous control, subtle dynamics, and deep emotional understanding to perform properly. It was one of the most frequently butchered pieces in the piano repertoire precisely because people underestimated its difficulty. But she could not explain any of this to Sarah without revealing knowledge that would prompt questions she did not want to answer. Sarah continued speaking, her voice taking on a harder edge. She explained that she had already seen Margaret's personnel file, which mentioned that Margaret had taken piano lessons as a child. This, in Sarah's mind, was more than enough qualification. She needed someone from the library, and Margaret was going to fill that slot whether she liked it or not. The performance was mandatory, Sarah emphasized, and failure to participate would be noted in Margaret's employment record as a lack of collegiality and team spirit, something that could affect future evaluations and even job security. The college was making budget cuts, Sarah added with barely concealed threat, and the administration was looking at commitment and cooperation as factors in determining which positions were essential. Margaret felt trapped. She had built her quiet life so carefully, and now it was being threatened by this arrogant woman who understood nothing about music despite making it her career. She could perform the piece easily, brilliantly even, but doing so would risk exposure. Someone might recognize her name, might remember the young pianist who had disappeared from the concert circuit 20 years ago. Yet refusing seemed equally dangerous to the life she had built. She needed this job, needed the health insurance, needed the modest but steady income that allowed her to live independently. Sarah did not wait for agreement. She placed the sheet music firmly on the desk, told Margaret that rehearsals would begin next week in the music building's performance hall, and walked out with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been told no. Margaret sat alone in the back office, staring at the familiar notes on the page, feeling the careful walls she had built around her past beginning to crack. That evening in her apartment, Margaret sat at her grandmother's old piano and placed the sheet music on the stand, though she did not need it. Her fingers found the opening notes automatically, the haunting triplet pattern that gave the piece its flowing, moonlit quality. She played it through once, her technique still flawless despite the years away from professional performance, her interpretation mature and deeply felt. Then she stopped, closing the keyboard cover with a sense of resignation. She would have to play this piece in 2 weeks in front of her colleagues, in front of Sarah Hendricks, who had no idea what she was demanding. Margaret decided she would play it adequately but not brilliantly, competently but not memorably. She would give a performance that would satisfy the requirement without revealing who she truly was. It seemed like the only way to protect both her present and her past. The following week, Margaret arrived at the music building's performance hall for the first rehearsal with a sense of dread she had not felt in years. The hall was smaller than the grand concert venues she had once performed in, with perhaps 200 seats and a modest stage that held a Yamaha grand piano that looked reasonably well maintained. Several other faculty members were already there, chatting nervously about their upcoming performances. There was Professor Anderson from the English department who would be reading poetry, 2 teachers from the visual arts department who had prepared a vocal duet, and a mathematics professor who apparently played guitar. Sarah Hendricks stood near the stage, clipboard in hand, radiating authority and impatience. When Margaret's turn came, she walked to the piano with measured steps, sat down on the bench, and adjusted her position. The instrument felt foreign and familiar at the same time. She had decided on her strategy. She would play correctly but without the interpretive depth that had once defined her performances, without the subtle rubato and dynamic shadings that transformed notes into emotion. She would be competent but forgettable. As her fingers touched the keys and began the opening triplets, however, something unexpected happened. The muscle memory was so deeply ingrained that her hands seemed to act independently of her intentions. The first phrase came out with more beauty than she had planned, the touch more refined than she meant it to be. Sarah's voice cut through the music after barely 30 seconds. She told Margaret to stop, her tone sharp with irritation. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys, confused. Sarah walked onto the stage, her heels clicking loudly against the wood floor, and explained with barely concealed condescension that Margaret was playing far too slowly and putting in too many unnecessary pauses and volume changes. This was meant to be simple background music for a faculty dinner, not a dramatic concert performance. Sarah needed the piece played straight through, steady tempo, no artistic interpretation that would draw attention away from the dinner conversation. She told Margaret to play it more like background music in a hotel lobby, pleasant but unremarkable. Margaret felt something stirring inside her, an old pride she thought she had buried. Sarah then made another demand that struck even deeper. She wanted Margaret to simplify the piece further by eliminating some of the more complex passages in the right hand, saying they were unnecessary flourishes that made the piece longer than needed. She had marked up a copy of the sheet music with red pen, crossing out entire measures and writing in simplified alternatives. Margaret looked at the defaced score with growing disbelief. Sarah was asking her to butcher one of Beethoven's most beloved compositions, to reduce it to a shadow of itself for the sake of convenient background noise. The other faculty members watching the rehearsal shifted uncomfortably. Even those with limited musical knowledge could sense something was wrong with what Sarah was demanding. Professor Anderson quietly mentioned that perhaps the piece should be played as written, but Sarah shut him down immediately, reminding everyone that she was the head of the music department with a professional background in performance, and she knew what was appropriate for such events. Her word was final. Margaret took the marked-up sheet music with shaking hands. She wanted to explain that what Sarah was asking was musical vandalism, but the words stuck in her throat. She was supposed to be just a librarian who had taken childhood piano lessons, someone with no authority to question the music department head. She nodded silently, collected her things, and left the rehearsal early, her chest tight with a mixture of anger and humiliation she had not felt since those dark days in Vienna. Over the next 10 days, Margaret found herself caught in an impossible situation. She practiced at home every evening, trying to force herself to play the piece the way Sarah demanded, but her hands refused to cooperate. Every time she attempted to simplify the passages or play with the mechanical steadiness Sarah wanted, her fingers would drift back toward the proper interpretation, toward the music as Beethoven had intended it. She would catch herself adding the subtle dynamics, the slight tempo variations that gave the piece its emotional power, and would have to stop and start again. Her co-workers at the library noticed the change in her demeanor. Margaret had always been quiet, but now she seemed withdrawn and troubled. Jenny Walsh asked if everything was all right, and Margaret gave vague assurances while internally struggling with a decision that grew more difficult each day. She could comply with Sarah's demands and play the butchered version, protecting her anonymity but violating every musical principle she had once held sacred. Or she could play the piece properly and risk the consequences of revealing her competence. The situation worsened when Sarah scheduled a second rehearsal just 4 days before the event. This time, several members of the college administration were present to preview the entertainment, including Dean Morris, a kind woman in her 60s who had always been supportive of Margaret. Sarah had arranged the rehearsal to showcase her own organizational skills to the administration, and she made it clear that she expected perfection from all performers according to her specific instructions. When Margaret sat at the piano again, she attempted to play the simplified version Sarah had demanded. It sounded hollow and wrong, the musical phrases truncated and awkward, the emotional arc of the piece completely destroyed. She made it through perhaps 2 minutes before Sarah stopped her again, this time criticizing her tempo as too inconsistent and her touch as too heavy. Sarah demonstrated on the piano herself what she wanted, and Margaret had to sit and listen as the department head played with poor technique, heavy hands, and no sense of the piece's architecture. It was torture for someone who had devoted decades to understanding music at its highest level. Dean Morris, sitting in the third row, looked uncomfortable. She leaned over to the college president and whispered something Margaret could not hear. Sarah, oblivious to the dean's reaction, continued her critique of Margaret's playing, now suggesting that perhaps the librarian simply was not capable of performing even this simple piece adequately. She made a show of sighing deeply, saying she supposed Margaret would have to do since there were no other options. But perhaps next year the library should find someone with actual musical ability. The other faculty members looked embarrassed for Margaret. Professor Anderson actually spoke up this time, saying that Margaret's playing had sounded quite beautiful to him, but Sarah dismissed his comment with a laugh, telling him that non-musicians could not be expected to understand the technical requirements of proper performance. Margaret sat on the piano bench, her face burning with humiliation, her hands clenched in her lap. Something was building inside her, a pressure that had been accumulating for 20 years. The night of the faculty appreciation dinner arrived with unexpected autumn rain. Margaret dressed carefully in a simple black dress and drove to the college's main event hall with her stomach in knots. She had decided during the previous sleepless night what she would do. She would play the piece exactly as Beethoven had written it, with all her skill and interpretive understanding, regardless of Sarah's demands and regardless of the consequences. If it revealed her past, then so be it. She was tired of hiding, tired of watching musical ignorance parade as expertise, tired of being treated as incompetent when she had once been exceptional. The event hall was beautifully decorated with autumn flowers and candles on each of the 20 round tables. Faculty members arrived in their finest clothes, greeting each other warmly. The college president gave an opening speech about appreciation and community, and then dinner was served while a student string quartet played soft background music. Margaret barely touched her food, her mind focused on what was coming. Sarah Hendricks, seated at the head table wearing a designer gown that must have cost thousands of dollars, kept glancing at Margaret with an expression that suggested she expected disaster. After dinner, the performances began. Professor Anderson read two of his own poems with quiet dignity. The visual arts teachers sang their duet competently, if not spectacularly. The mathematics professor played guitar and sang a folk song that was charming and well received. Then Sarah stood to introduce the next performer, and Margaret felt every muscle in her body tense. Sarah's introduction was brief and dismissive, mentioning only that Margaret Chen from the library would be playing a piano piece, with a tone that suggested low expectations. Margaret walked to the grand piano that had been positioned on the stage, aware of every eye in the room following her. She sat at the bench, adjusted her position, and placed her hands over the keys. For a moment she simply sat there, breathing deeply, letting the anxiety drain away and the music fill her mind. She thought of all the years of hiding, all the years of diminishing herself, and made a conscious choice to let it all go. Then her hands descended to the keys, and she began to play. The opening notes of the Moonlight Sonata emerged with such clarity and beauty that conversation in the hall immediately ceased. Margaret played the piece as she had always known it should be played, with the gentle rolling triplets flowing like water, the melody singing above with heartbreaking tenderness. Her touch was perfect, each note precisely voiced, the pedaling creating a shimmering halo of sound that filled the room. She had not played publicly in 20 years, but her technique had not diminished, and her interpretive maturity had only deepened with time and life experience. The audience sat transfixed. This was not background music for dinner conversation. This was art of the highest caliber, played by someone who understood the piece not just mechanically but spiritually. Margaret moved through the first movement with complete authority, navigating the subtle tempo fluctuations that gave the music its breathing, living quality, building the intensity in the middle section where the harmonies darken, then returning to the opening theme with even greater poignancy. Every person in that room, whether they knew music or not, understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. As the final notes faded into silence, there was a moment of absolute stillness in the hall. Then the applause began, not the polite appreciation that had followed the other performances, but thunderous, genuine applause. Faculty members rose to their feet, the standing ovation spreading through the room. Dean Morris was clapping enthusiastically, tears visible on her cheeks. The college president looked stunned, clearly recognizing that something far beyond his expectations had just occurred. Even the students working as servers had stopped to listen, and now they too were applauding. Margaret sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, feeling 20 years of tension draining from her body. She had done it. She had played truly, played honestly, and the relief was overwhelming. She stood and gave a small bow, then walked off the stage on unsteady legs. As she returned to her seat, colleagues she barely knew reached out to touch her arm, to congratulate her, to express their amazement. The woman who had been invisible for so long was suddenly very visible indeed. Sarah Hendricks sat at the head table, her face frozen in an expression of shock and anger. Her carefully constructed authority had just been demolished by the humble librarian she had dismissed and bullied. Everything about Sarah's expertise had been called into question by those 7 minutes of playing. How could the head of the music department, with all her supposed knowledge and professional background, have failed so completely to recognize the level of talent sitting before her during rehearsals? How could she have demanded that such a pianist simplify and butcher the music? The other faculty members were already whispering, glancing between Margaret and Sarah, making connections and judgments. After the performances concluded and the formal program ended, people crowded around Margaret with questions. Where had she studied? How long had she been playing? Why was she working in the library when she could clearly have a performance career? Margaret answered briefly, saying only that she had studied music seriously many years ago but had chosen a different path. She was polite but guarded, not yet ready to fully expose the past she had hidden for so long. Dean Morris approached and asked to speak with Margaret privately. They stepped into a quiet corner of the hall, and the dean's words were kind but direct. She said that the college had clearly been unaware of the remarkable talent on their staff, and she wanted to understand why Margaret had never mentioned her musical background. Margaret explained briefly about her former career and her reasons for leaving it, her burnout and desire for a quieter life. The dean listened with compassion, then said something that surprised Margaret. The college had been considering starting a small community music program for adult learners, nothing too ambitious, but they had lacked someone qualified to lead it. Would Margaret be interested in teaching a few evening classes, perhaps coaching amateur pianists while maintaining her library position? Margaret felt something shift inside her. The idea of teaching, of sharing music without the pressure of performance and competition, appealed to her in a way she had not expected. She told the dean she would think about it, but even as she said the words, she knew her answer would be yes. Playing tonight had reminded her of what she had lost, but also of what she still had to offer. Perhaps there was a way to bring music back into her life without returning to the destructive aspects of her former career. The days following the faculty dinner brought changes that Margaret could not have anticipated. Word of her performance spread through the college community with remarkable speed. Students who had never paid attention to the quiet librarian now approached her with questions about music. Several faculty members who had attended the dinner made a point of visiting the library to tell her how moved they had been by her playing. The college newsletter featured a story about the surprise revelation of hidden talent among the staff, with Margaret's performance prominently mentioned. Sarah Hendricks, meanwhile, had become notably subdued. She avoided the library entirely and was overheard by several people making excuses for her failure to recognize Margaret's abilities, claiming she had been busy with administrative duties and had not had time to properly evaluate the rehearsals. But the damage to her credibility was significant. Faculty members began questioning other musical judgments she had made, and there were rumors that several students had complained to the dean about her teaching methods and dismissive attitude. Sarah's reign of unchallenged authority in the music department was effectively over. Margaret met with Dean Morris to discuss the proposed community music program in more detail. The college would provide space in the music building for evening classes 2 nights per week, and Margaret would teach beginning and intermediate piano to adult learners from the surrounding community. The pay would be modest but meaningful, and more importantly, it would allow Margaret to reconnect with music on her own terms. She would be sharing her knowledge with people who loved music for its own sake, not training future professionals who would face the brutal competitive pressures she had escaped. It felt like a form of healing, a way to reclaim the joy that had been lost in her previous career. During this same week, Margaret received an email that shook her. It was from Robert Chen, her younger brother whom she had not spoken to in over 15 years. They had become estranged after their mother's death, their relationship strained by family conflicts and Margaret's withdrawal from everything connected to her former life. Robert explained that a friend of his had attended the faculty dinner and recognized Margaret's name and had described her performance. He had tracked down her email through the college website. His message was brief but emotional, saying that he had missed his sister, that their estrangement had been a source of pain for him, and that he hoped her beautiful playing meant she was finding peace with music again. He asked if they might reconnect. Margaret read the email 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She had not realized how much she had isolated herself, how many relationships she had sacrificed in her attempt to escape her past. That evening she replied to Robert, and within days they had arranged to meet for lunch. It was awkward at first, 20 years of silence standing between them, but as they talked, Margaret began to see how much of her life she had walled off unnecessarily. Robert told her about his family, her niece and nephew whom she had never met, and she felt the weight of lost years pressing on her heart. The meeting with her brother prompted Margaret to make other changes. She contacted 2 old friends from her Juilliard days, people she had cut off when she left the music world. Both were surprised and delighted to hear from her, and neither judged her for disappearing as she had feared they might. They understood the pressures that had driven her away, and they welcomed her back into their lives with warmth and forgiveness. 3 months after the faculty appreciation dinner, Margaret stood in front of her first adult piano class, looking at the 8 students who had enrolled in the community program. They ranged in age from 30 to 75, and they came from diverse backgrounds with one thing in common: a love of music and a desire to learn. Some had played as children and wanted to return to the instrument. Others were complete beginners fulfilling a lifelong dream. Margaret felt nervous, but also excited in a way she had not experienced in decades. She began the first class not with technical exercises but with a question. Why do you want to play the piano? As each student answered, sharing their personal stories and dreams, Margaret realized that this was what music was supposed to be about. It was not about competition or critical acclaim or perfect performances reviewed in prestigious publications. It was about human connection, about expressing emotions that words could not capture, about the joy of creating something beautiful. These students would never play Carnegie Hall, but their music would matter just as much because it would be genuine and heartfelt. The teaching brought unexpected fulfillment. Margaret discovered that she had a gift for helping others overcome their struggles with the instrument, for finding the right words to explain difficult concepts, for encouraging students when they felt discouraged. Her own technical mastery allowed her to demonstrate passages effortlessly, but more importantly, her years away from music had given her patience and humility. She did not demand perfection, she celebrated progress. She did not criticize harshly, she guided gently. Her students adored her, and word of the excellent new piano teacher spread through the community. Sarah Hendricks eventually left the college, accepting a position at another institution under circumstances that remained unclear, but were rumored to involve administrative dissatisfaction with her performance. The new music department head was a collaborative, humble man who immediately reached out to Margaret, asking if she would be willing to occasionally coach his piano students or give masterclasses. Margaret agreed, finding that working with serious music students was also rewarding when approached from a place of support rather than judgment. Margaret's relationship with her brother continued to deepen. She became part of her niece and nephew's lives, attending their school concerts and birthday parties, experiencing the family connection she had denied herself for so long. Robert's children were fascinated to learn that their aunt had been a famous pianist, and Margaret began teaching her niece basic piano skills, passing on the gift that her own grandmother had given her so many years ago. One evening in early spring, nearly 6 months after the faculty dinner that had changed everything, Margaret sat at her grandmother's old upright piano in her apartment. She was alone as she had been on countless other evenings, but this time the solitude felt different. It did not feel like hiding. It felt like peace. She played through the Moonlight Sonata again, remembering that night when she had finally allowed herself to be seen, to be known, to be vulnerable. The music sounded even more beautiful now, enriched by everything that had followed. Margaret understood finally that running from her past had never been necessary. The problem had not been music itself, but the toxic environment surrounding professional classical performance, the judgment and pressure and impossible standards. She had thought she needed to choose between music and peace, but she had been wrong. She could have both, and indeed she now had both. Her life was fuller than it had been in decades, connected to others through teaching, reconciled with family, and most importantly, at peace with herself and her gifts. The humble librarian had become a maestro again, but this time on her own terms, in a way that brought joy rather than pain. She had learned that sometimes the greatest courage is not in hiding who you are, but in allowing yourself to be fully seen, talents and vulnerabilities alike. As the final notes faded into the quiet apartment, Margaret smiled, truly content for the first time in 20 years.